Good morning. We are ready to turn to Nehemiah in our study of Ezra and Nehemiah. And our lesson today is going to cover the first two chapters of the book of Nehemiah. We get to meet him for the first time in this study. Still haven't met Ezra, by the way, but that will come. Who was Nehemiah, anyway? What do we know about him? Anything. It can be anything. Literally anything. Tell me one thing about him. Okay, he was going to work to help build the wall. Which one? Which wall? Yep, at Jerusalem. We know anything else about him? Okay, patient and prayerful. Let's go back even further than that. Very beginning type stuff. Like he was a Jew. Okay, so there's a start. He was a Jew, one of the survivors of the calamity that came upon Israel. Where was he, actually, at this time? We've been looking in the first 6 chapters of Ezra how Zerubbabel and Jeshua and this first group of people had gone back and they were tasked with building the temple. Well, that work had seemingly mostly been completed. Meanwhile, Nehemiah was still in the pagan country. He was still in the land to which they had been taken, very much like Esther was during that the time when the events of the book of Esther took place. She was still in the Babylonian country. Well, Nehemiah was in that country, not in Israel, at least yet. There is a detail about him that is given in the book of Nehemiah. Right there at the end of chapter 1, just you would think that would probably be one of the first things that he mentions, but it's almost like he just adds it to the end there and suddenly informs us that he was the cupbearer for the king. One of them, at least. He was cupbearer, the king's cupbearer, and that king was Artaxerxes. So that position was certainly nothing to be frowned upon. I mean, he was a slave. I mean, he was. That's what he was. He was a servant. He was a slave. But there would be some natural benefits to having that job, that role, if you want to call them benefits. But we learn just little things that are mentioned here and sort of the dynamic between Nehemiah and Artaxerxes informs us or sort of indicates something about their relationship and his role. Not too much, but at least maybe a little suggestive in that direction. But what the book of Nehemiah, or this beginning part at least, is recording is sort of setting up what his role was going to be in this whole grand scheme and series of events that are taking place in Ezra and Nehemiah. Yep.
You know, it may seem kind of strange that Nehemiah was in that position because it was all according to God's providence. But you would think the king, instead of having a slave of a Jew being in that position, which would be, he
Yeah.
Maybe there was other ones.
Yeah.
It seemed kind of odd, because I know that just the fact that God gave him charge of it, he was putting emphasis on just for his people.
Yeah, it would, by the very nature of that job, you would have to be an incredibly trusted person. I mean, obviously, one of the things, at least it seems, was the role, I guess, to be as conservative as possible, possibly was the job, would have been tasting the wine and whatever he poured into the king's cup, which, you know, if you're thinking about poisoning the king, it's not the greatest job you would want to have, because basically you're just making sure the king isn't going to die. And the only way, I guess, assuming that the poison would kill you no matter what, the only way to prove whether or not the wine or the drink was poisoned is if the person that tested it does die, or at least gets very ill or something like that. But at the very least, he would be the one pouring for the king and waiting on him and attending to him, which would mean almost constant access. I mean, he's right there. I mean, he's there whenever the king needs him. And, you know, on a day-to-day basis, that they're going to be together quite a bit. I mean, that's a lot of face time, if you will, one-on-one time with the king. I don't think there's any doubt that God's doing something. I mean, God's working here, just like he has been already. The fact that Nehemiah, not just being a Jew, but being the kind of man that he was in this position and had this, very much like Esther. Esther rose, and Mordecai, remember, we just studied very recently, told her, you know, who knows whether or not you've been put here for just this time, this exact time. Same could be said of Nehemiah. He was put in this position at some point, but the events that are going to be recorded here in the opening of this book may be just the kind of event or turn of events that the reason God wanted him there in that position. If it had been somebody else, it may not have played out the way that it did because it was Nehemiah. So about 13 years had passed since Ezra had led a group of Jews from Babylon to Jerusalem. We haven't looked at that yet, but they were going to sort of touch up, do some more final finishing touches kinds of things on the temple. But there were things that were not going so well in Judah, in Jerusalem. And Nehemiah was going to find out about this. And that's how the book, more or less, the book opens. So we'll just, rather than going any further, we'll just get into what the text says and look at it there. So the book begins. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. And as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. So it seems that a band of some kind was sent to Judah, to Jerusalem, possibly by the king himself, to see, to check up on that area, not for their benefit, but for his own benefit. One of the things that they had been accused of was that if you let them do this, they're not going to pay tribute, they're not going to They're going to sort of try to take over their own lives and do their own thing and become their own sovereign place. And they're not going to, it's going to hurt the royal bank account, basically, if you remember that accusation. Well, that may be the kind of thing that the king had in mind to, just see how, if things were the way that they accused that it might be. So they go there for whatever the reason, and they come back, and Nehemiah is not so much concerned about the stuff the king would have been concerned about. He wants to know how the people are doing. From the Jewish perspective, how are things going there? And the news was not good. He said they're in great trouble and shame. And one of the reasons is because, or at least among other things, the wall's broken down, its gates are destroyed. Why would that be such a big deal? That's it? That's the only thing he's got? Well, that's all he said. Why would that be such a big deal? Wall's broken and gates destroyed? I mean, no protection. We kind of take for granted that, I'm not sure if you'll find a single city in the United States that has walls around it, unless it's a flood wall of some kind. We are blessed, and not just in the United States, but in other places in this day and age. Back then, wasn't that way. Walls were necessary to protect your city, because without the walls, anybody could just come in. Yep.
To be fair, today a wall wouldn't really work, so it's kind of pointless to have you. Because any kind of explosive weapon will just break.
That is true. How about door locks? Would that be a modern equivalent, maybe? In a more individual sense, which an explosive device would do that too, but usually robbers and such are probably not going to be coming in with bombs to your house, but they could happen. But we have locks on our doors and things like that. Back then, the walls you're either a fortified city or you're a city that's just a sitting duck. And now that the walls were broken down, which by the way, it kind of begs the question, is he referring to all the way back when Nebuchadnezzar came in and destroyed the walls and broke it all down? Or is he referring to something else that may have happened since then, more recently? The language almost seems to lend itself towards the fact that something new had happened more recently to either just make it worse, or maybe they had started to build up a little bit and they broke it down again. But at any rate, as it stood at that moment, the walls are broken, the gates have been destroyed. Not a good condition, because now they're vulnerable to all their enemies around the land, from the lands around them, which we already know were already presenting themselves as adversaries to them. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, this devastated him. He was torn up about this, which shows how much he loved and cared about his people. Didn't affect him personally. And yet, as soon as he heard, he said, he sat down and wept and mourned for days and fasted and prayed. So this is sort of setting up what Nehemiah's role, basically Nehemiah's entry into this whole situation. Dean, do you have something else?
Well, according to our history, even in this nation, during the World War, that there were being walls put up, but they had outposts along the seacoast, so that even if the ships coming in, they had great big guns,
Yeah. Yeah, protection was, especially for them, you have to remember they're already were a little blip, in the big area of that Middle Eastern part of the world. Well, now that little dot has gotten even smaller, and they're still property of Persia, and everyone around them is seemingly an enemy. So they're vulnerable, they're at risk, they're potentially in danger, and Nehemiah breaks down in mourning for days, and as we're gonna see, more than just days, and he prays, and you can learn a lot about his character just in the reading his prayer. Just like we talked about David the last couple of Sundays on Sunday afternoon, reading some of the Psalms that David wrote, it's almost like you get to peek into his heart, because that's where those words came from, his heart. Same is true of Daniel, and when you read his prayer, and Nehemiah for that matter. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. It's a beautiful prayer. I mean, so here's what he said. He said, "O Jehovah, God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments." By the way, there's a lesson in that alone. "Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel which we have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I have chosen to make my name dwell there. They are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name. And give success to your servant today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man." That was his prayer. And then there's the detail. Oh, by the way, I was cupbearer to the king. So many things in that prayer. It's not that long, but he praises God to start as the God of heaven, the great and awesome God. He's a God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. He asked him to hear. Please listen. He confesses sin, the sin of the people in general. And more personally, he says, even I have sinned. Humility. My father's house, we've sinned. We've acted very corruptly against you, not keeping your commandments. Just like the breaking down of the wall, this also sort of begs the question, is Nehemiah talking about the sin that got them into captivity in the first place, 80, probably almost 100 years ago now? Or is he interpreting the current state in Jerusalem as evidence of the same kind of sinful behavior pattern? Take your pick, it could be either one. They both might be true, but at any rate, he's confessing the sin, and he understands that God had said, and that's what he says, remember what you commanded Moses, if you're unfaithful, I'll scatter you among the peoples. Well, that's exactly the position they've been in. Why did that happen? It wasn't God's fault. It was their fault, and he's acknowledging that. But what he's mainly referring to here is, you also said that if we return to you and keep your commandments, then you'll reverse that. You'll gather us back together to the place that you've chosen, and make your name dwell there. So that's what he's asking for. That's what his prayer is. Almost, I guess, suggesting that that is what's taking place, where he, at least, and he's speaking kind of on behalf of the people, we are returning. We are in the process. We are striving. We are seeking you. We're returning. So that means your promise applies. The other side of your promise applies now. So be attentive. Hear us. Hear me. Can't overemphasize, though, or emphasize enough that the restoration of God's people and God's steadfast love and keeping of his covenant is dependent upon his people keeping his commandments and following him, seeking him in the keeping of those commandments. That is stressed multiple times in this short prayer. As he had commanded Moses. So the law, for the Jews, it was the law of Moses. For God's people today, it's, I guess, instead of Moses saying the word you commanded Moses, it would be more like the word that you commanded your holy apostles and prophets, and especially your son, Jesus Christ. Other than that distinction, it's exactly the same principle and always has been for God. God keeps covenant with those who are faithful to him and keep his commandments. God will never break the covenant, but he'll let us break it. So, notice also, he says, give success to your servant. That's him. Your servant is him. So, me, he means. Give me success in the sight of this man. Who in the world's that? What's he talking about? This man? Where'd that come from? What man? Jim Bob around the corner? Next door neighbor? The king, yeah. He is preparing and anticipating that he's about to go and take something. I shouldn't say this. He's going to take something before the king in this matter. That is clearly indicated by him saying, give me success before this man. Give me mercy in the sight of this man. So what we learn, though, as chapter 2 begins, is that up to around 4 months have passed between when he received the report from his brother, who, by the way, it has been suggested that is possibly his actual brother and not one of his, not brother in the sense of he's a Jew like me, but maybe was his actual blood brother. Again, 50-50, take your pick. 4 months from that to the beginning of chapter 2. So Nehemiah 1:1 gives a time stamp. Nehemiah 2:1 gives a time stamp. And those are about 4 months apart. So it seems that Nehemiah had spent the last 4 months either meditating on it or preparing or praying and fasting to some degree and things like that, because now we're 4 months later all of a sudden. Yeah, go ahead.
You already read that he prayed for days.
Yeah.
So that would, it could possibly, 3 or 4 months.
Yeah.
But he did pray over that time.
Yeah, he wept and mourned for days. I guess nonstop. I mean, straight. How much mourning? How much time do you need to grieve? Well, it varies from person to person. So it may be that he spent several days, consecutive days, weeping and mourning over this. But he also during that time was praying and fasting. And then here we learn that it went on, and maybe we're assuming that this went on for the 4 months. But what we know is that 4 months passed, and it may be because the king wasn't around. I mean, he may have been away, but that's not necessarily indicated in the text. So it says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. Interesting. Interesting little detail to throw in there. And the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart." Then I was very much afraid. Whoops. I said to the king, "Let the king live forever." That's always a good thing to start with. If you're ever before a king, I guess. We see a pattern kind of like this. Let the king live forever. You'll always win with that one. Safe words to begin with. You always want the king to live forever, not even long. Let him live forever. "Why shouldn't my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" So, a couple things here. I've never been sad in his presence before. Now, the reason he said that is because he was sad in his presence right now. On that day was the first time he had ever been sad in the king's presence, which almost suggests that was kind of one of the job, something in the job description of the king's cupbearer was, don't be in a grumpy mood or look sad around him. You want to do everything to make him real happy. You want the king to be real happy. You don't want to give him a distraction or make him think something's wrong or dampen his, be a cloud in his sunny day, or always do things to cheer him up or at least to maintain his cheerfulness. Otherwise, it's pretty impressive that he had never, ever been sad in the king's presence. And it's also because he says when the king noticed, he was very afraid. Why would he be very afraid when the king noticed his sadness if there wasn't something to not being sad in front of the king, visibly sad? Otherwise, I don't know why he'd be afraid, unless he was just afraid because now the moment has come that, I'm going to bring this up. But at the same time, it seemed to be connected to the fact that he noticed. But he's like, what's the problem? You're not sick? Are you sick? You're not sick? What's going on? What's the problem? What do you have to be sad about? Easy for a king to say, Everything's going great. So that's when he said, "Why shouldn't I be sad?" It kind of sounds smart, Alec, when you just read it from the page, from the way we might add a certain tone to it. Like, why shouldn't I be sad? Wouldn't you be sad if this was happening? But obviously he didn't mean it that way. If he was afraid, that would have been a horrible way to all of a sudden respond to the king. But he's just making the logical common sense argument that I'm sad because I ought to be sad, because the city in which my father's grave, the burial place, among other things, of my father's graves is lying in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Well, that was enough for the king to understand that there's more to this. So he said, "Okay, what are you requesting? What do you want?" And this is maybe the most interesting part. "So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king," if it pleases the king, then he gave his request. But think about that for a second. He's in the middle of a conversation, a one-on-one conversation. The king notices he's sad. He says, "Why are you sad?" He says, "This is why I'm sad." The king says, "What are you requesting?" He prays to God. And then he says, "This is what I'm requesting." Where's the time there for a prayer to God? Is what I'm getting at. Did he walk out the room and say, "Hold that thought for just a second," and he goes away, and then he takes 30 seconds, a minute, 5 minutes, prays, comes back, so sorry, Your Excellence. What I'm requesting is this. It doesn't seem to be that way. He just prayed to God right there, instantly and quickly. What is my point? My point is this. a prayer doesn't necessarily have to be a very long, drawn-out, formulaic thing with a set time and a set place. That might be the rule. Like Daniel had 3 times a day that he would pray and go to near his window or whatever, and with his normal custom and practice. But that's not to say that if there was a certain circumstance that arose where right then a prayer was in order, he could say a prayer in his own mind, just as brief as it can be. God knows what he's talking about. What if his prayer was like this? Oh Jehovah, be with me. Just that thought came in his mind right then, before he said, this is what I'm requesting. Wouldn't that be perfectly sufficient? Considering he's already been praying for up to maybe 4 months, and at least right before this happened, give me success and give me mercy in the sight of this man. So I think sometimes we get the impression that the only way to pray is for it to be this certain exact kind of way, out loud, maybe even in front of people, or what have you. But that's not necessarily the case. Nehemiah prayed to God right there, all of it real short, real quick, just a few seconds probably. He's not going to stand there in silence when the king asks him a question for an extended period of time. He prayed to God, just something short and sweet before he answered the king. So what's he asking? Well, here's what he's asking. If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. Whoa, that's no small request, I would say, especially for the king's cupbearer or one of the king's cupbearers. What I'm asking is that you send me to Judah, so I can go try to fix this, the state of the city of the place of my father's graves. The king said to him, with the queen sitting beside him, there's a nice little detail that wasn't mentioned otherwise. How long will you be gone? And when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, well, let's not go there yet. So he gave him a time, and it pleased the king. He granted it. He said, sure, we can do that. Prayer answered, wasn't it? Remember when we read, I think it was the end of last lesson, maybe in Ezra 6, how it was the wording specifically in the last verse of Ezra 6. They kept the feast of unleavened bread 7 days with joy, for Jehovah had made them joyful and had turned the heart of the king of Assyria to them, so that he aided them in the work of the house of God. Well, guess what? He's done it again. He's done it again. God's at it again. He turned the heart of the king to his faithful servant Nehemiah, so that he granted the request to go to Judah to help rebuild the city, or the walls and the gates and whatnot. So, providence, answered prayer, courage, the power of God for sure. What good does it do Artaxerxes to let this cupbearer go to Judah to rebuild the walls? What benefit will that give him? Any thoughts? Okay, maybe he'll get he'll be more liked. It might make him a little more popular. I would say that's the absolute maximum that he would get. It does not affect him at all that the walls of this city that he doesn't even care about, that is how many miles did we say? Not hundreds of miles, 900 maybe, miles away. Doesn't affect him at all. He doesn't care. Why would he care about that? If anything, it just increases the potential of some negative effect, like he's already been warned about. And remember, this is the king that had ordered at some point in the history that some of this be stopped, that we studied and learned earlier at some point in the unfolding years. But at any rate, it doesn't really benefit him much. But on the other hand, he is losing a very valuable, faithful servant. He may have liked him. I can't help but think the kings probably had their favorites. I'm not saying Nehemiah was his favorite, but you almost have to have a favorite. If you got people rotating, serving you every day, it's only natural that you're going to click with one more than the others. And maybe I'm reading between the lines, but I see a somewhat cordial, personal relationship here, because not in some far-fetched kind of way, like they were best buds, but if you're going to be with somebody every day, how can you avoid, and not just with him, but actually personally, one-on-one, serving the king and whatnot, you're going to develop some sort of relationship, however you want to define relationship. And I see a pretty casual, maybe that's the word I'm looking for, seems pretty casual between them. What's going on? Why are you so sad? This is not some big formal king speech, Why art thou so sad, my son? But just like you would say to anybody, what's wrong? What's going on? And he answered casually. He responded, pretty casual. And all of that may have been God. God may have had a hand in that as well. Yep.
I think that's, I think that, like you said, I think God's hand is definitely control here, because just like with Job, when he was so down in Egypt and all that, how that God protected him while he was down. So they showed favor unto his captives all the time that he was there. And just like here, with him being cut there, and he is shown, God is showing favor through him to the king. How he did it, with those seemingly God's protection. I'm not saying that God took over the king's heart, but seemingly he was pleased with this individual.
Mm-hmm.
However, whether you want to call it God's providence, whatever, but seemingly God was there protecting the individual.
Yep. Nehemiah knew, he understood that. Yep.
He answered positively before he answered the negative as to why he was sad.
Mm-hmm.
He first built up the king.
Yeah.
The king lived forever. He reassured him. And then he told me why. Which made sense. It was a family thing.
Yeah, and maybe there's a hint of apology in that tone, in that opening statement. Let the king live forever. Like, I'm so sorry. I didn't. This wasn't pre-planned or anything to come in here looking sad, or I'm sorry for being sad enough that you noticed, or something like that. It's kind of in some way it's kind of built into it because of that positive affirmation or whatever. Before he's loyal to the king. He has been, and he still is. Yes. But beyond the river, I think generally that would be considered the Euphrates. Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, almost every time the river is mentioned like that, at least in the context of this time period, it's not referring to the Jordan River. The Jordan River is probably, without a doubt, the most prominent river in biblical history, Old and New Testament. But in these kinds of contexts, it seems to be the Euphrates, yeah. So it's going well so far. Now Nehemiah really shows his confidence in God maybe, or in his protection in this situation, because he's going to press this. He's going to go farther. Rather than thinking, okay, I'm going to take this win and be pleased and go from there. No, he's not done. Then now he asks, if it pleases the king, let letters be given me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah, and a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates, and so on and so forth. And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. There it is right there. Nehemiah already attributes everything that just transpired to God. God was with me, he says. And that's why he granted my request to go to Judah. And even further than that, he's going to write me letters to facilitate and further help my effort there. And if you didn't notice, part of that was that he be given wood and lumber for the beams and such to build. So also being given supplies as well. So that may have been a tall order or a risky, request, but he granted it. So then in wait a minute. Oh, the next couple verses, this part of this section too, very quickly. Came to the governors of the province beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. The king had sent with me officers of the army and horsemen. There's some more things that the king did for him. Now we meet a chief villain. I don't even know how to say his name. Your guess is as good as mine. We're going to call him Sanballat, just because it sounds funny, okay? I highly doubt that is anywhere near the way that is pronounced. But anyway, and Tobiah. These guys are going to be some of the chief opponents of the work here. When they heard about it, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. That's kind of cruel, isn't it? They were extremely displeased that someone had come to help these troubled people. It says a lot about them. It also says that they don't like the people of Israel. We don't want anybody to come and help the people of Israel because we don't like the people of Israel. To be totally fair, I don't think there's any doubt that the Jews probably would have viewed it the same way if the tables were turned. But anyway, so I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. So this is the last section here. Nehemiah goes in almost on a reconnaissance mission. He goes in, doesn't tell anybody what he's doing. He hangs out for 3 days, maybe rests up. Long journey, as we already mentioned. He gets there. He doesn't make a big fuss or announcement or anything. He's just sort of hanging around. And then he goes and he inspects the city walls, checks up, wants to see it. He heard the report. He wants to see it for himself. Goes around. He checks these places. There were places where the rubble was so high and piled up that he couldn't even get an animal through there. It was not good. This would not do. So finally, he gathers together the priests and the wealthier people and officials and whatnot, and he says, "You see the trouble we're in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates burned, with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision." And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, "Let us rise up and build." They're on board, in other words. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. And we'll just leave that there. He tells them, they say, "You're absolutely right, let's do this." And they strengthened their hands for the good work. There's an example for us right there. Among other, we're out of time, but other applications we might see. Strengthening our hands for the good work. When we see a work that must be done, we should make every effort to get that work done. And they strengthened their hands for the work. They made sure that they were going to be able to do the work. It's not like they were, already chomping at the bit or whatever and, ready to just take off, but they strengthened their hands. They prepared themselves. They psyched themselves up. They motivated themselves, that whatever you want to call it, for the work. And we ought to do the same thing. Instead of making excuses.